Great, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. So tonight's conversation sits at the intersection of three forces shaping the next decade: artificial intelligence, national security, and physical infrastructure. I want us all to think for a moment about the places that operate beyond the reliable reach of the cloud. So think like oil rigs, mines, disaster zones, remote infrastructure, and these are sort of the environments where decisions are incredibly time sensitive and where AI has a lot of potential to make a difference. Kind of raises an important question as well in terms of who's building the infrastructure to bring AI to those environments, and that's the conversation we're here to have tonight. Cannot think of two better people to lead that conversation. So our guest is Dan Wright, co-founder and CEO of Armada. He's spent his career bridging AI and data infrastructure to enterprises. With Armada, he's tackling perhaps the hardest version of that challenge yet. So building these modular AI data centers that can be deployed anywhere in the world, really delivering real-time compute to places that the cloud simply can't reach. Moderating tonight's discussion is our very own Steve Bowsher, CEO of InQtel and investor in Armada. So welcome, Dan and Steve. And Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Ernestine. Thank you, Dan, for taking the time here to speak to all of us here. As I reached out to you at the beginning when we arranged this, I think what you're doing, and Ernestine gave a great introduction there, is really fascinating and really timely, meeting the moment, if you will. And so I'm excited to get into this. But I just want to say good evening to all the class here as well. I'll start first, Dan. I always like to start on the personal side first. You're an entrepreneur. You're building a fantastic company here. How did you get here? Tell us about your sort of personal journey.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve, and thanks for having me. And great to see everybody. So my background, I actually grew up in this area. I'm actually from the kind of foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, up where they did the gold rush. So Auburn area, but my whole extended family is from this area, the Bay Area. So I spent a lot of time here growing up. And
shout out, by the way, to the In-N-Out in Auburn.
That's our claim to fame in Auburn. They call it Tahoe's halfway point, but it's really just the last In-N-Out burger on the way to Tahoe. So highly recommend it. I spent a lot of time there. Yeah. Also Arcadas, if you're into really good pies.
Yes, we stop at Arcadas as well.
Yes. Okay. So when I started building tech companies, I started kind of interested in data and AI broadly. My first company was a company called AppDynamics that did application performance management. This was like when companies were first moving online, going from brick and mortar businesses. Like, back in the day, you used to go into a bank to do a banking transaction. Now you do all that stuff on your phone. But if the app doesn't work, then that company loses out on business. So my first company, AppDynamics, was focused on making sure those apps just worked and that they never crashed or had slowness. And then I got into an AI company called Data Robot that I ran after AppDynamics was acquired by Cisco. I had to stay on for a couple of years at Cisco, and was working with a lot of like very large industrials and then in defense with a focus on helping them to adopt AI and kind of how they ran their companies. We had this thing that we called the AI-driven enterprise. We wanted everybody to be what we called a citizen data scientist, make it easy for kind of lay people to use. But what I realized from those conversations was that AI had actually not reached most of the world. It's easy sitting here in the Bay Area.
This is what year?
This was back in like 2019, 2020 that I first really started thinking about this. And I was having lots of conversations with people talking about how they wanted to use AI in their operations on the ground, but there was a huge blocker, and that was infrastructure. And then I really started to dig into that, and I said, okay, well, why is that? Well, if you look at a map of the world, only about 30% of the world has data centers, which means 70% doesn't have the infrastructure to actually enable AI. And so I became obsessed with that problem, and then that was the beginning of Armada.
Great. And so what year did you start Armada?
Started Armada at the end of 22.
Okay.
December of 22 is when we officially incorporated the company. Background there is that one of my investors in my last company, a firm called 137 Ventures, and I were talking about this problem, and they said, oh, well, actually, you should talk to Gwynn at SpaceX, Gwynn Shotwell, and Robert, her husband, because Starlink is kind of focused on this in terms of the connectivity, and you guys are just thinking about it in terms of like taking that to the next level with the infrastructure. And so started talking to them, started talking to my friend Trey Stevens over at Founders Fund. And before I knew it, I couldn't stop working on this problem.
Yeah.
And I was talking to my customers saying, hey, if you had infrastructure on the oil rigs, at the mine sites, on the battlefields, in an emergency emergency scenario in a rural area, what types of things could we solve? And I realized, number one, there was a huge amount of data being generated in these areas, largely from drones, cameras, autonomous technologies, and there was no good way to process that data. And then secondly, a lot of the biggest problems that could actually be solved with AI were there, but again, the infrastructure was the blocker.
Great, and we'll get more into what the company and what it does in a second, but first, so you started one company before in AppDynamics,
Yeah.
right? Talk me through the thought about going back to the entrepreneurial role and starting another company. Was that a hard decision for you? Was it an easy decision for you? How do you think about the trade-offs?
I would say that once you start a company, it is, I think, addicting. It's not for everybody. There's a lot of people that would be probably miserable building a company. But if it's for you, once you do it, you can't think of doing anything else. So for me, I always knew I would continue to do this.
So were you just looking for the right idea to get going again?
Yeah, I mean, building companies is incredibly hard, and
Right.
you should assume if you start a company, it's going to take 10 years to actually make it successful or to achieve the mission of the company. So I wanted to be sure that it was something that I felt really strongly about, and 10 years later, I'd still be happy I was working on it. And then the second thing for me was, and Trey and I talked a lot about this, I was at a point in my career where I wanted it to be a problem that was not only a big problem where you could create a lot of value, but it was something that was a good quest. It was something that nobody else was solving that needed to be solved. And I felt like I had a unique ability to solve it.
And so was no one solving it because no one understood the problem or the opportunity, or no one thought they could build the technology to solve it? What was it that you saw that no one else saw that said, hey, I'm going to go after this?
Yeah, I mean, so the edge, we
Right.
call ourselves the hyperscaler for the edge. The mission of Armada is to bridge the digital divide, to be the infrastructure for that 70% of the world that has net infrastructure. And what we saw was, while people had talked about the edge for a really long time, the timing had made this the perfect time to build it. Because number one, the connectivity problem was being solved by LEO and GEO satellite providers. Just take Starlink as one example. It didn't exist until November of 2020 is when it launched in public beta. Initially, it was only a consumer product for the first couple of years, and then it went into enterprise, and then it went into government. Right, and so it was brand new, but that was an enabler, along with other LEO and GEO satellite providers, like there's Kuiper from Amazon and other things. And then the other thing that was new was that all of the data had gone to the edge, and I'd say that is the biggest thing that nobody quite appreciated until recently.
I agree.
Is that 80% of data now is generated at the edge, far away from traditional data centers. And then we also saw that there were other kind of unique tailwinds. For example, it's kind of interesting to think about this as a tailwind, but the focus on sovereignty, data sovereignty and data security, because cyber attacks are getting more and more pervasive and more sophisticated, and that's only going to continue. And then the last is that, if you think about end of 22, things like ChatGPT had, I think, just launched. There was no XAI at that point. There was no Anthropic, right? So all these new models were just getting started. Yeah. And so the kind of core insight was, in order to actually make those capabilities available at the edge, we didn't need more chips. We actually didn't really need more models. What we needed is to take what we already have and enable it to run in these environments where it had never been able to run before.
Okay, so 2022, we're in this world where the big hyperscalers are building out these huge data centers. We hadn't really gotten to the point where everyone started to appreciate just the tremendous amount of compute cost that was coming. So everyone thought the compute cost was manageable back then, I think, right? And then there was this idea that hey, these guys are achieving huge economy of scales. They know how to run these things. Power was an issue. They were all co-locating these things by power. But what you were starting to realize, perhaps ahead of other people, was the action wasn't at these centralized points of processing. The action was at the edge, where all the data was being generated, and it was costly to transmit all that. It was inefficient to transmit all of that, and then you also lost sovereignty of your data. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, when we launched the company, when we first came out of stealth, I wrote something about distributed intelligence, and the whole idea is that to the point about the hyperscalers, for the last couple of decades, we've had centralized compute. And that works really well when you don't have any constraints on energy, when all the data is actually generated in these major metropolitan areas where we have the data centers. It breaks in a scenario where all the energy is distributed and all the data is being generated in these distributed locations. And so the sort of founding insight and the founding thesis was data is going to be distributed, energy is going to be a limiting factor on AI and is distributed. So the reason that we called the company Armada, one of the reasons, was that previously you had to have the data sail to these faraway data centers, which is like fundamentally inefficient. Instead, we'll take these data centers, which we call galleons. A galleon's a ship, and we will bring them to the data and the energy where it lives in a way that is way less expensive. It is much faster time to value. It's much more secure, and it also allows you to kind of scale up capacity versus with the traditional hyperscale data centers. One big problem is that you have to make a massive CapEx investment before you actually know what the demand's going to be. And this actually flips that completely.
So what does the architecture of your data center look like, and compare and contrast that to the architecture of the hyperscalers? Maybe. And then there's a tier in between, but we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah. So my two co-founders brought some unique insights as well. So one is my co-founder and COO, John, who took a identity management company, Okta, public, and then the other one.
Pretty certain I looked at Okta, about investing in Okta in 2006.
Yeah. I mean, John and I we had almost identical experiences, him at Okta and me in AppDynamics, and we were actually taking the companies we both incorporated those companies. We were about to take them public at the same time, and then Cisco bought us 2 days before our IPO. He took Okta public and did that for a while. But what we kind of learned from that was a lot of lessons about like focusing on a big problem that really matters, and then trying to do it better than anybody else and sort of lock out the competition. And so that was the core insight there. With Pradeep, our founding CTO, he actually built Azure at Microsoft for a decade. So he saw this problem, and he knew that number one, the only way to build what we were going to build in terms of like distributed infrastructure is to do it full stack, the same way that the hyperscalers have done. And if you don't know what full stack means, it means that you do the hardware, you do the software, you do the AI, you kind of enable a marketplace of different applications and AI models that end consumers want to use. But the key thing is that you make it super easy for people to use, because the thing that people fundamentally loved about cloud infrastructure is just the ease of use, the ease to get started, and kind of the availability on demand. But what we also saw was that they were never going to do this because the operating system, the way that the cloud providers built it, was built for centralized compute. And so they would have to basically completely re-platform their architecture, which they weren't going to do because they were too busy competing against each other in their traditional market. So we took the insight of doing it full stack, but then we applied it to distributed compute versus centralized compute.
So full stack, but different stack.
Yes,
right?
full stack, but different stack.
Okay, great. So when did you come up with the idea of shipping containers?
Yeah, so actually
And explain why I asked that question.
It was funny. So this is actually kind of a cool story. When I was thinking about founding Armada, I went out on San Francisco Bay with some good friends of mine, and Trey actually, I think we had a conflict, he wasn't there that day. And I'm out on this like little ship, and there's all these big tankers around me. And I'm looking at the shipping containers there on these ships, and then at the port over in Oakland. And I'm like, well, that's really interesting because number one, shipping containers are all ISO certified, so they're really easy to transport, which is going to be important because we're going to be sending these things all over the world.
They transport on ships, on trains, on trucks, all sorts of different modes of transportation.
You can even put them in planes, like C-17, C-130s. You can take them by helicopter, so they're just very transportable. And a lot of things are optimized in the world for shipping containers, as it turns out. The second thing is a lot of these things are housing and processing very sensitive data. And so the more they look like something that is innocuous, like a shipping container, the less of a target they are. And we knew that that was going to be important because data centers are now critical national infrastructure. We've seen this in the Middle East with the AWS data centers getting hit in the conflict over there. And when that happened, we started getting calls saying, how many of your shipping containers can you send over here and how fast can we get them? We'd already optimized to get them there within days. We deployed within a few days. And then secondly, they look, again, like a normal shipping container. Right. So they're just not as obvious. And then they're very resilient because you can have many of them versus just one centralized unit.
Yeah. And so and by the way, it's a theme. One of the things I'll talk about a little bit later is the speech I gave this weekend, which I gave a shout out to Armada.
Thank you.
About the idea of we are moving from an era of preparation for conflict into an era of conflict, and what this conflict looks like based on the evidence of Ukraine, Venezuela, and Iran, is a forward deployed conflict where people need to push out intelligence, which is really what data centers and AI processing is, manufacturing and integration out to the edge. And the leading companies that are doing it, whether it's Armada, whether it's a company called Firestorm in the manufacturing side that I think spoken here, or maybe not. Not yet, okay. Firestorm has 2 shipping containers that open up, connected by a tent, and all of a sudden you 3D print drones inside this thing. So again, you can push it out to the edge. And then what I didn't talk about as much, but I'm also passionate about, is forward deployed energy. Like, how do we get these things to live off the land? Because one of the things you hear about in Ukraine is the ratio of diesel generators to military units is going up like crazy because everybody has to recharge all these things. And so this ability to generate energy and store energy and then transmit energy at the edge, I think, is a really interesting problem for any of you looking for problems to solve as part of your thinking here. But anyway, so back to the company. Okay, so that's a great, I think, description of what you guys are doing, the problem that you're solving, the technical architecture that you're pursuing there. Let's cover just a quick facts of the company. How much money have you raised? How many employees are you? Where are you sort of in product evolution to shipping product and customers, all that stuff?
Well, so we incorporated the company again at the end of 22. In that time, we have deployed our technology all over the world in like kind of the most austere, crazy environments, which is pretty cool. We get pictures from customers and team members. We call our team the Armada, sticking with the Armada theme, from all over the world. And just to give you a few examples, last summer we deployed on a U.S. Navy ship. First time this has ever been done. It's public, part of the Unitas exercise, running things like Minotaur and Maven and other types of applications at the edge, processing large amounts of data from drones. First time that's ever been done in the middle of the ocean. We also did the first deployment in the Arctic ever with the state of Alaska. They use Skydio drones for emergency response, responding to avalanches and floods. We were able to take them from having over a day of latency to real-time intelligence at the edge to help save lives. We also were the first to, on the flip side, deploy in the middle of the desert with Aramco, the largest energy company in the world, and goes on, Aker BP, rigs in the middle of the ocean, and many others. I think this idea of distributed intelligence sort of hit a nerve, and so every one of our funding rounds ended up being oversubscribed. We have a large funding round that we haven't announced yet, so don't tweet it. But after that, we'll have raised about $500 million in capital from the top investors in the world. Microsoft's a big strategic investor in the company. Mitsui and BlackRock invested in this most recent round, among others. And so now what we're doing is we're just scaling, and our focus is on what's called sovereign AI. So the idea of that going forward, people are going to want to have ownership over their stack, the infrastructure. They're going to want to be able to use different models securely at the edge. even air-gapped. And so that's what we're enabling in both the private sector and in the public sector. And then in terms of just kind of like giving you a sense of scale, we're approaching 400 employees. We're operating in over 100 countries. And we're working with many of the largest private sector customers in the world. And then we're also working with the U.S. government in many different pockets, ranging from the Navy to the Coast Guard and CBP and others. But then also with allies. For example, I gave the one in the Middle East where we were getting urgent calls and just shipping out these galleons to try to help with the situation over there.
So let's talk about the concept of sovereign AI, because I think that's a pretty interesting concept. It means a little bit different, I think, to the private sector clients as opposed to your federal government clients, as opposed to there are countries that are talking about sovereign AI now as well. Talk me through what it means to each of those groups, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So sovereignty has always been something that's been discussed when it comes to data and AI in general. But I would say up until like 5 years ago, when people talked about data sovereignty, they mainly meant just keeping it within a country's borders. And now when people talk about sovereignty, it really in both the private sector and the public sector, what they mean is number one, that there's sovereignty down to the site level, so that the data actually doesn't leave an individual oil rig or mine or base. And then they also want it where they actually can take ownership over what models are running on that stack and even the infrastructure itself. And so that's one of the things that we're very focused on. And how this manifests, I'll give you a couple like private sector examples, and then we can talk about the public sector. If you talk about like a very large energy company, let's take Aker BP, which is one of the largest ones in the Nordics. They have a series of things that they want to run. They want to run things from Microsoft. Microsoft has models. They want to run things from Halliburton and SLB and Weatherford, kind of the industry-specific people. And then increasingly, they want to run kind of cutting-edge AI models and robotics securely air-gapped at the edge on huge amounts of data, terabytes of data being generated in these sites every day. Because what their end goal is to have fully autonomous rigs by 2028. And so we're helping them where there's immediate problems that we can solve with this stack, which is kind of the stack that they've chosen. They can then deploy it at one rig and then go to many rigs. And then ultimately what they're trying to do is get to full autonomy by 2028. And if you go across critical industries, whether it's oil and gas, mining, manufacturing, it's really the same pattern. And so I would say for those who are thinking about building, think about what infrastructure and data you're working with, because if all of these companies are trying to do full autonomy, and then increasingly countries are trying to do the same thing, there's a huge opportunity in just creating different types of AI models, different types of infrastructure like we're doing, of innovating at different layers of the stack to enable that, which again is fundamentally different from centralized infrastructure.
And I think one of the lessons of the last couple of years is the vision of full autonomy, because as Dan said, no one's really gotten to full autonomy yet. But the vision of full autonomy out there, it breaks the centralized model down.
That's right.
You just can't ship all the data out, run the model in some centralized place, ship the instructions back from the model results fast enough to make anything meaningful function. It's all pushing out distributed, forward deployed, at the edge, whatever phrase you want to use. But it's a fundamental shift in architecture that I think creates opportunities for companies like Armada. When I think a few years ago, people thought, oh, the world's just going to be run by all the large language models, frontier labs, and all the data centers and NVIDIA, right? Yeah. And I think we're realizing that conclusion or conventional wisdom maybe from a couple of years ago isn't really playing out the way we all thought it would.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing. And there's kind of this tension between sort of enabling autonomy and then cybersecurity. So like what makes the Aker BP example such a good one, or you take a Ramco or any of the big energy companies that we work with, is they all want to go towards full autonomy, but they can't move the data off their site. When they talk about data sovereignty, there's a hard, what's called segregation between IT and OT. So the only way to actually enable autonomy is to deploy infrastructure behind their firewall on each one of their sites. It's impossible otherwise. And so that's what we're enabling. But then like the same thing is true in the public sector. And then you also can solve the latency problem. And to the point you made about Firestorm, I was with the other Dan Maggie, at Camp Grayling last summer.
Dan's the CEO, founder of Firestorm.
Yeah, and then we were there with our partner Skydio, the drone company, and then Chariot Defense, the generator company, and ex-Anduril guys. And it was exactly as you were describing. They were trying to figure out how do we do forward deployed compute, physical AI, in a way that we can get real-time intelligence at the edge securely with no latency, because that base is a very remote base. If you had to send everything to the cloud, you would have hours of latency, which is not going to work if you're trying to do any sort of automation.
So another phrase you hear a lot from government these days is live off the land. You know, if we are preparing for a conflict in Taiwan, we're going to prepare for that conflict on a bunch of different islands, which have tremendous logistic challenges associated with them from a contested logistics perspective. And so there's a lot of interest in creating these self-sustaining stacks, maybe on the island to do whatever it is you want to do there. And I think Armada is going to play a key role in that. A couple years ago when we were doing this class, we used to bring in lots of what I would characterize as dual-use companies that were selling technology to the private sector and to the public sector. In the last few years, with the explosion of companies just wanting to sell to U.S. Department of War and other military things, I think we've gotten away from a little bit of that in terms of our set of companies here. So I'm really curious to ask you this next question here, which is, as a entrepreneur, CEO, founder of a company that's selling to both the private sector and public sector, compare and contrast a little bit what that sales go-to-motion looks like.
Yeah. I mean, so for us, there are some similarities, mainly because we are selling to the largest companies in the world, right? Like the companies that we sell to, for them to adopt new technology because of their cybersecurity requirements, the certifications that you need to have, and just their procurement processes, you're looking at usually 18 months to 2 years. So it's kind of like its own valley of death. But the reason we do it is once you get in, you can expand very, very fast, and then it's very sticky because it's hard for anybody else to get in. I kind of think of obstacles to entry in some ways being a feature, not a bug, because it creates a moat for you. But you have to, one, focus on a really important problem, because all these people, whether you're selling to the public sector or the private sector, they're too busy. Like nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to buy some new tech, right? They wake up in the morning because they have critical problems that they need solved, and you have to be able to attach to a critical problem that's urgent. And then I think with the public sector, one, I'm glad that you're all here and that there's more companies now building in the public sector. I think there's more venture capital dollars flowing into that than there's ever been, and part of that is because there's more of a track record of successful tech companies being built in that area, and part of that is because there's more willingness from the government to work with startups than there's ever been in the past. But it is fundamentally different, and like one of the first things that I did this time around is I sat down with Trey, who's on my board, who spent his entire career selling to the public sector, Palantir, Anduril, and I said, tell me everything you know about government contracts and how to get through the valley of death, and I took it all down. I already knew a good amount of stuff, but I hadn't spent my whole career doing that. And what I learned that we've really applied is that you never want to be dual use in the sense that you're only halfway in on selling to the government. You really have to be all in, because selling to the government is incredibly hard, and most companies that focus on doing it fail. Like doing a startup period is extremely hard. Doing a startup where you're only selling to the government is like, it's like the final boss. It's like that much harder. And so you really have to understand what you're doing. And the best way to do that is to try to learn from others that have done it successfully and then apply those lessons. And then you have to be all in. And when I say all in, I mean you have to hire all the cleared people. You have to focus on all the different certifications that are going to be required from day one. You have to hire lobbyists. You know, most startup founders are like, why would I hire a lobbyist? That's expensive. I don't want to do that. You cannot sell to the government without lobbyists. It's like impossible. So you have to understand appropriations. You have to do all of these different things. which are just fundamentally different than selling to the private sector. There are some similarities if you're selling to like the big companies, but there's a lot of differences as well.
So I'm going to ask Dan a couple more questions here, and then I think I'm going to turn it over to all of you for questions. So now would be a great time to start thinking about what questions you might have for Dan. All right, first question. Are the hyperscalers just watching this and saying, you know what, that's fine, we're going to let that market go to Armada and other companies? We are completely consumed with our own businesses and our own opportunity here, or are they starting to react in some ways?
In some ways, it's better than that, actually.
Okay.
So in some ways, they're all kind of coming to us and partnering with us. We announced a sovereign AI partnership with Microsoft, which is one of our largest investors. And they actually tried to do something like we're doing years ago, and it actually twice, and both times it failed. And so what they decided to do this time around was partner with us. Their stuff runs on our stack natively, including they've got a piece of hardware called Azure Stack that runs some of their services that customers want to run at the edge. We gave that a home. So we basically can just include that piece of hardware along with other hardware in our galleons. But then what customers really like about it that is a problem that really none of the hyperscalers can solve themselves is that we have a very open architecture that's meant for distributed compute and that can embrace all of their different services from all of the different hyperscalers and extend those to these more remote areas where they've never been available before. And so right after we launched the Microsoft partnership, Google reached out, and then AWS reached out, and then Oracle reached out, and now we're working on partnerships with all of them. Microsoft actually shut down its edge line of business and just said, we're going with these guys. Yeah.
Awesome. That's great. Fantastic. All right. Last question. You can't talk about data centers these days without, unfortunately, talking about U.S. public policy. And so last week I was with some staffers from the Hill who were telling me that AI is polling really poorly in the numbers that they're seeing. Data centers are polling really poorly in the numbers that you're seeing. One, I think all that's directed more at the massive data centers that the hyperscalers are all trying to build, next to cheap sources of power. But is that affecting you at all, and do you have any thoughts on that phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true. Data centers, the hyperscale data centers are not very popular right now. And it's kind of interesting if you dig into that a little bit. Why is that? One is a lot of the big projects that have been announced haven't actually created any actual value. Most of the data center projects that get announced actually will never be built. And that's because they're extremely expensive. There's a lot of supply chain issues just to get everything lined up from the power to the chips.
Yep.
And so a lot of those projects are delayed. Nobody's actually received any value. At the same time, a lot of them creating huge amounts of kind of impact on the community. Noise, for example, and critically in certain parts of the country, electricity bills going up pretty significantly. And then there's issues with water, other things. And so what we talk about is getting all of the benefits of data centers with none of the drawbacks, because what we can do is we create immediate value. We deploy within days or a small number of weeks, and then you scale up with demand. So you don't overbuild, you don't build the wrong thing. They're also like parking versus construction, so the permitting is much, much easier. We co-locate them with whatever power is available. And a lot of times there's just stranded energy that we can use. There's about 6 gigawatts of stranded energy just around the US that's available for use if you bring the data center to it versus making the power come to the data center. And a good example of how this can work in practice, and because we use behind the meter power in some cases, when that happens, you actually don't impact electricity bills because you're not pulling from the grid. And a good example of how this works in practice is we just closed a very large deal in Australia, so I was just out there, and they have about 7.2 terawatt hours of energy that was renewable energy from wind and solar that was curtailed last year, meaning that it was wasted because the grid is totally overloaded and couldn't accept it. And so what we did is we just worked with the Australian government and a local partner. We brought the data centers to that energy. You get instant value with basically none of the drawbacks.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Great session. Thank you, Dan.